Good news. What I want to talk about today is something that's been around for a little while, this idea of incorporating allocation trade into the buyback, particularly obviously the restoring the balance scheme. We've been doing a little bit of work talking to irrigators in the last year or so, and so part of what's been going on with that is reflected in the discussion that I'd like to have this morning. So we'll just get into it. There's a number of authors involved, obviously, and a couple of them are here today, so you can always give your questions to them afterwards if it's necessary. Just a quick overview. I won't actually dwell, I'll just get into it. So I'm assuming that a lot of people are familiar with the buyback, obviously, for those of you who aren't. We're looking at a budget of about $3.1 billion. It's obviously stemmed from the Living Murray, where we had the original 500 target, now to the National Plan for Water Security, or the Restoring the Balance 1500 gig target. And of course, under the guide, now we're moving up to aspirational 3,000 or 4,000 gig targets. There's some thinking that to reach that level might require another $1.6 to $5 billion of additional spending without the transaction costs involved in that estimate. But from our point of view, the things that are most interesting are, obviously it's not about the volume, it's about the quality and the timing and the sites that are involved. And also it requires this continued participation by irrigators to obviously take place, and that's where we're really interested in what's been going on. So we begin by thinking about the two essential phases, which are not mutually exclusive, obviously. We have the first phase around the acquisition, the various ways in which we could actually get the water for the environment, and then we move on to, and potentially maybe still acquiring water as we get to the management phase to optimise delivery. So there, of course, we're trying to mimic the natural flows and to try and, obviously, if we do continue to acquire water, to minimise market distortions. And a bit of this was discussed by Jeff Connor on Wednesday, this idea of bringing some trade into the process, and by a few others I noticed at the conference. That doesn't seem in the right order. Not to worry. So we started to think about how this might play out in Australia, and we started to think, well, is there anywhere else that's actually doing it at the moment? And we obviously turned to the Western US, where some of this has been going on for some time. The situation is different. I mean, there's a fisheries focus, and obviously they have the seniority rights, more of a piecemeal approach to what they're doing. But there is quite a lot of temporary transactions going on there, where they would possibly prefer to have more permanent sales taking place. But in fact, temporary has been the norm. In fact, about 87% of them have been temporary transactions, majority spot leasing on the market. And they've noticed quite a few benefits resulting from this, some ideas around institutional learning taking place, and an eventual sort of conversion over time of temporary to permanent sales. It's also provided some flexibility for the environmental managers, which has been quite good. They are vulnerable to drought shocks and also to the possibility of market distortion, but that would probably be no different here in Australia. So that in itself gave us some good lessons. And also sort of raises the point again, Productivity Commission and others have been talking about these ideas of what could we do? Could we just simply stick with entitlement purchasing alone? Could we in Australia have perhaps a mixed approach? Counter-cyclical trade, as Matt Kirby's proven with some models, would potentially be quite beneficial. And then the discussion around derivative products, options contracts and leasebacks. So there's lots of things that we could do here in Australia. And if we did, what would happen? How would we perhaps assess those under different criteria to see what was the best for us? So again, Stuart Whitten quite nicely set me up on Wednesday with his water quality discussion around some of the some of the criteria that we could use for assessment. Things like efficiency and effectiveness and the equity. And from our point of view, specifically, we're really interested in how do you perhaps meet that adoption criteria as well? How do we ensure that that continued willingness takes place, that the irrigators are involved in this process over time? And do these alternative products allow for that? So again, if we followed strategy, would they play along? So we come then to the survey work that we did. We talked to about 1,000 irrigators in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin in September, October last year. And amongst other things, we were particularly interested in talking to them about whether they participated in buyback. So in that instance, whether they were not interested at all, whether they had considered being involved, whether they'd submitted a tender or indeed whether they'd sold water. And then we also looked at whether or not they were agreeable or amenable to this idea of alternative products, so the allocation trade, entitlement leasing, or the options contracts. And we're finding that if we leave the slightly or the serious interested people out, because it's hard to say that they would participate, but if we look at those that have participated, quite high levels of those irrigators would be involved in alternatives to entitlement leasing. And then again, for those who are entirely not interested in entitlement purchasing, some fairly good numbers around those who would also engage in the alternative products. And then state by state, not seeing a lot of difference across the 3 states that were involved for the products, although entitlement leasing is a little bit less popular than the other 2, but still more or less up there. So, given that we were getting somewhat favourable results, and that's consistent also with what Scockamara and Collins found in a much smaller survey in 2006, we thought we'd model fairly 2 simple scenarios based on the Goulburn Murray Irrigation District here in Victoria, for which we've got quite an extensive range of information around monthly price and volume data. We thought we'd look at a 10-year spread, much as the same as the restoring balance scenario, but across 2001 to 2010. So we have obviously the allocation and the seasonal data for that, and then matched up the budget around the restoring of balance numbers. So 2 scenarios are buying entitlements only, consistent with what we're currently doing, and we looked at purchasing once annually over the 10 years in the February-June period, where prices are predominantly fairly amenable, and then also a strategic purchasing in the non-drought years, of which there are 6 in this case. And we also looked at full participation and declining participation. There's a literature that's suggesting that after about year 5 you're going to see some drop-offs in willingness. And then the second scenario was a 50-50, so 50% entitlement, 50% allocation trade. Again, purchasing annually, purchasing strategically, and then based on some of the figures we've got, thinking that full participation is probably fair in that instance. Okay, that does it. So, where we're at. With the full participation, if we were buying each and every year, we get about 373 through our modelling, targeting obviously 442 in the GMID. If it's declining after year 5, then that's substantially reduced. We're about 140 gigs down on where we'd like to be. Strategic though, buying only in the drought years, we're up closer to the target, but of course with the declining participation that falls away again. If, on the other hand, we move to the mixed purchasing strategy, and this is under the assumption that we're spending everything we've got each and every year, then we're getting some quite larger numbers, a 10-fold increase, about 3,000 gigs with the buying each and every year, about a little bit under that actually delivered. And then if it's full participation in the non-drought years, we're closer to the 4,000 gig target for the Goulburn Murray alone, delivering around about 3,700. And if we followed that strategy of equal amounts of allocation and entitlement, we could have actually continued that process for 6 years after the 10-year cut-off, or for 14 years if we bought only in the non-drought years. Alternatively, if we'd taken the budget surplus, we could have continued to buy entitlements opportunistically on the marketplace for anywhere up to 10 years. And then that's just obviously graphically representing. And you can see the drought years, 2003, 06, 07 and 08, and just the different volumes that could have been acquired under different strategies. So where does that leave us? We're quite, again, I was quite interested to hear Glenn Whitworth talking on Wednesday about lengthening the structural adjustment process, because we find that that's quite a valuable benefit from what's going on here if we were to follow this sort of strategy. I've put up that it requires lower investment. That's probably actually not quite true. We're probably looking at a 20% increase in costs from what we're currently spending. But of course, if the figures are right, then we're looking at a much larger recovery as well. But we still do get a tick on the efficiency. An increased net social welfare would come out of this, so we get some equity benefits. Similar to the US situation, we would have much greater flexibility for the environmental manager, which would be a tick on the effectiveness. And as far as we're concerned, if what we're finding from irrigators across the basin is correct, we've got this increased willingness to participate, a little bit like the American situation again. because as we know, participation in the allocation market is extremely different as far as irrigators are concerned to the entitlement market. When we saw the market kick off, obviously much greater participation in allocation trade than entitlement trade. And so we may see some benefits here as well. And those are around things like less risk, more observability. You've got Graham Marshall's assertions that if the irrigators can see what others are doing, again, greater level of adoption, trialability as they did in the allocation market, and conversion benefits would hopefully be present as well. There are some issues though, it's not all sunshine. It would require more complicated institutional arrangements. In the terms of ongoing negotiation with irrigators, obviously short-term decision making, which is perhaps not inducive for bureaucracies. But at the same time, this process is going to require a lot of that anyway, particularly the short-term decision-making for the environmental manager. So it's not outside the realms of possibility. Some similar magnitude with different types of transaction costs, and we're doing some work, particularly with Dustin, to try and do some calculations around those over time. And of course, it would increase the program duration if what we're talking about years-wise would come into being. It could be a negative for governments with their political cycles, but ultimately, of course, we're talking about a long-term arrangement for the environmental manager in any case. So that's not necessarily, in my view, a complete negative. But finally, we think that if you're going to really pull this off, it does require a sophisticated understanding of why irrigators use the allocation market, what their motives behind allocation trade are, and what they require from structural adjustment. And we get a much better picture of their engagement. And I think, yes.